interests of sort of confidentiality, we'll only record the bits where we're talking you through the slides. We'll turn the recording off for the questions so that you can feel free to be as frank or open as you want. I mean, I'm not particularly imagining any very controversial questions that you'd be worried about sharing, but just so that you don't feel constrained by that as well. And of course, please do feel free to follow up with any of us afterwards. So today we're going to be particularly focusing on the cost of living and the war in Ukraine and its interaction with how we think about and talk about climate change and the path to net zero. This work is the culmination of a 6-country project that we've actually been working on over a little over a year, and has been based on actually now 3 rounds of polling and a series of focus groups right across the country, with a particular focus on the red wall and the blue wall, because we know that they're particularly important for lots of your campaigning work and objectives, not least us. And I can't quite believe I'm saying this. We are sort of gearing up to get into the sort of general election manifesto influencing stage as well. Some of you will be familiar with the British 7 segments, which feature in Britain's Choice and also as part of our collaboration with Climate Outreach in Britain Talks Climate. Others of you might not be, so I'll do a very sort of quick sort of canter through that, but I won't dwell on it for too long. We polled, it's now actually in excess of 20,000 people across the country, and supplemented that polling with a series of focus groups. And we identified 7 distinct segments of the UK population. What's interesting about the segmentation, or at least I think, is the fact that unlike previous segmentations, it's entirely values-based. So demographics don't go into the model at all, and it instead uses things like Jonathan Haidt's moral foundations theory. And the 7 segments are progressive activists. They are the most kind of politically engaged, left-leaning group, particularly concerned about injustice. Civic pragmatists, who are a group who also lean left, but think through a sort of less political lens, tend to be more engaged in their local community. Disengaged battlers, who are a group who are generally much less economically secure, quite urban, the most BAME of the groups that we have. So they have a, in particular, we find that lots of people of South Asian descent are in the disengaged battler group. Established liberals are, I guess you might call them, I sometimes call them a sort of Cameronite conservative. They tend to be kind of more liberal, as the name suggests, in their outlook, generally voted conservative, but have been slowly moving away. And then your closest proxy to this notion of a blue wall voter as well. So we'll talk a little bit more about them. Loyal Nationals, on the other hand, are the closest proxy to a red wall voter that you find. They are a group who are quite socially conservative, but actually also quite deeply concerned about inequality amongst the strongest supporters of the NHS, disproportionately concentrated in the red wall. Disengaged traditionalists, you might associate, again, if you're using kind of the political narratives with sort of white van man or Essex man or woman. That's obviously not gendered term, but they're a group who particularly sort of prioritize getting where you get to in life by yourself, quite individualistic group, but actually not that interested in politics. And backbone conservatives, who, I mean, the name slightly does what it says on the tin, quite traditional, nostalgic group. And you can see from that graph, it's interesting to show that these groups haven't been static over the past few years in terms of their voting intentions. There were actually quite significant shifts. Both you see that shift in the sort of red wall, the Loyal National, and a bit of disengaged traditionalist voter shifting to the Conservatives, and that established Liberal group actually moving slightly away, even at a time when the Conservative vote went up quite a lot. If we go to the next slide, you can see how those votes have changed. So this is based on our latest polling, which only concluded a couple of weeks ago. So it's quite of the moment. And in particular, what you see is actually lots of the groups are quite steady, but there are those two groups, the loyal nationals and the established liberals, who's had the biggest swing against the Conservatives and towards Labour. And it sort of does actually, very often, sometimes these sort of media press narratives about different groups don't actually ring true, but you can actually see the swing there. And even more starkly on the following graphs, if you look at sort of your typical blue walrus, you can really see that change in the established Liberal vote. It's also what some in the press are wrongly calling Waitrose women. In fact, we've done polling on this segment and found that they are most likely to shop at Tesco, actually, and is also fairly evenly gender split. But again, yeah, the press like their slogans, but you really do see that shift, and again, a similar shift amongst the red walls. So you get the increase in the Conservative vote in 2019, and then a decrease up to now, particularly in the wake of Partygate. And in general, what we find is in focus groups, and I think this is particularly important for thinking about sort of campaigning and also policy work, is that there's a lot more fluidity. There is a lot more to play for than there has been in a lot of kind of, in the previous general elections. And again, thinking about sort of shaping and crafting policies, I think that's quite important. If we go on to the next slide, just to give you a bit of context, I don't think this will surprise many of you, but it is worth emphasising quite how much cost of living now eclipses almost every other issue. And we get this both from our qual in our focus groups, and it's every type of voter in every type of seat talking about it. I think that's quite important as well, whereas traditionally you might have associated talking about the cost of living with less economically secure voters. Now what you get is, and I think it's a particular there's a particular group who are not the group of people who are going to struggle between, they're not making the heating or eating choices, but they're having to make real sacrifices in the quality of their life. They might have decided actually, after 2 years of COVID, they were looking forward to taking the kids abroad. They're not going to be able to do that anymore. They've had to change where they do the weekly shop. Previously, there was sort of, some people sort of called them the just about managing group, and they're the group that you really hear from. And just to give you a sense of the sort of change in people's priorities. So when we polled the segments in November, you saw the very clear, actually, each of the segments having slightly different priorities. So progressive activists, it was overwhelmingly climate change, through to loyal nationals, for whom it was small boats, backbone Conservatives, similar disengaged traditionalists, cost of living. Fast forward to today, and every single segment puts cost of living as their number one issue. Reassuringly, I think, actually, for those of us concerned about climate change, you see that climate change is holding its own. It's still there for progressive activists, still there for established liberals, and actually as a whole, when you look at the entire country, as was on the previous slide, it's basically that it's cost of living, and then it's the NHS environment and the war in Ukraine sort of tied together. So even in this context, people are still concerned about it. It's still a top issue for people, and I think that's quite reassuring. And actually, the credit to the sort of both awareness raising and consensus building work that the sector has done in recent years, that this isn't just being kind of blown out of the water by current events. If we go on to the next slide, perhaps unsurprisingly, people don't think that enough is being done to help with the cost of living. There has been a bit of a dip, and that dip comes after the Chancellor made his most recent announcement about the targeted support, particularly for the most economically vulnerable, but also turning the the energy loan into an actual rebate. But, some real, people really through conscious, the fact that we're now in 1 in 20 saying that they are doing without the essentials, similar numbers saying that they are using a food bank. And then you've got this really, a lot of people taking, perhaps what you might call smaller steps, but steps which are having a significant impact on their lives. For instance, cutting down electricity, shopping around more, and eating less as well. So this isn't, and I often say this when I present to sort of political audiences, that this isn't one of these hypothetical, situations, it's having very real consequences. And some of the stories in focus groups that people tell about having to take on extra jobs, no longer being able to see the kids at weekends, really actually, sometimes quite difficult to listen to, which obviously, and this is why we wanted to do this session, create some challenges in terms of how we talk about something like climate in a way which, marries the issues and recognizes there really are synergies, and the public, as we'll say, make those synergies and connections as well, but without seeming like we're not recognizing that for most people, it is cost of living first, second, and third. Go on to the next slide. I also said we're going to talk a bit about the war in Ukraine, and I think it's particularly important, again, for those of us interested in climate. I know that, and it's certainly one of my worries, but from talking to some of you, I know it's been one of yours, that kind of post-Brexit, was the UK going to turn inward? And certainly some people, that's what we wanted. Actually, I think what the war in Ukraine has shown actually is that that's not what people want to do. Actually, in our focus groups, our polling, we found actually quite great pride in our response to the war in Ukraine from people. People very, people are very supportive of us arming the Ukrainians. And what's interesting is where there is disappointment, even amongst quite conservative groups, such as the disengaged traditionalists, who are normally very migration skeptic, there's actually quite a lot of frustration that we're not doing more to take in refugees quickly. I think that's dissipated a bit now that the Homes for Ukraine scheme is more up and running, but it's really striking and quite a change in narrative. And I think, we've also been doing quite a bit of work on migration. There's an opportunity to perhaps rethink, where the British public are and what we can build on from Ukraine. We go on to next. And I also thought this slide was interesting, just as part of the wider context. We polled people after the Chancellor U-turned on the windfall tax. And, whilst there are those of us who think that U-turns are sort of, political suicide, it was clear from this polling that the public either thought it was a good thing, in fact, slightly more did, or thought that it was neither a good or a bad thing when a politician changed their mind on a big issue. And I think that's both an opportunity, because it's always a reminder to us, I guess, as people who are, pushing for action on climate, that even things which have seemed off the table, actually there is a chance when things change to go back to, but it's also a warning, right? That I remember I've done in the past quite a lot of work on international development, and I know that there was some hope that actually the public would react against the fact that there was a promise to maintain 0.7% in the manifesto, and actually when the government did cut it, actually you found the public say, well, circumstances have changed, so they had to change it. So it's a recognition that actually when it comes to some of the climate pledges, there actually also might be more space for politicians and others to duck out of their accountability as well. So worth bearing that in mind. We're going to. So what does it mean for how we talk about climate? The first thing, and I now say this in every talk, is you have to recognise that people are exhausted. There's this real sense that we had Brexit, then we had the pandemic, and now we've got this cost of living crisis. Most people just want to get off the roller coaster and for it to stop. And there's they basically want things to work better in Britain. And that's increasingly coming out. In a group in Hitchin last night, I asked people to give a few words to describe Britain in 2022. And the most common word was a big mess. People want things to work better. And I think there's an opportunity for, us involved in climate to kind of look at that. How can we help things to work better? How can we tie it to things cost less? But at the same time, recognizing that there is such little appetite for kind of the radical next new thing. So there's a bit of kind of tempering there with lots of the public. We've got to not inadvertently be seen as, oh my God, this is the next exhausting change that I'm going to have to deal with as well. And it's why, actually a lot of people kind of struggle with that sunlit upland message about kind of just transition. Sometimes, you do need those positive messages, but they've got to meet people where they are, because the other side is obviously, and we're doing another seminar on kind of populism and political trust, is that lots of people, actually now you talk about climate change with people and they'll say, well, politicians didn't follow the rules on parties. They're going to make these rules for us on climate, but they're not going to follow them themselves. So that cynicism is something that, like it or not, we've got to work with. Interestingly, one of the things we've had is that Britons in particular find the climate movement unwelcoming. So most other countries, it was about 70% that we polled found the climate movement welcoming. That dropped to about 50% in the UK. Interesting to think about why that might be. In fact, actually, you can see it there, sort of 70, 60 in other countries and 50. No doubt part of that is obviously coverage of some of the stop oil and insulate protests as well, but worth bearing that context in mind. And then I think there is where there is the opportunity, I think it's an opportunity that we have to be careful in navigating, is that actually when you ask people what are the biggest issues relating to climate change in the environment, a significant number directly link climate change with increases of the cost of food and energy. So the public are already making that link in their mind. And actually when you ask them to prioritize one of them, so plastic in the ocean comes top in every poll that we're doing this, even though it's not directly linked. I'm more relaxed than some people about that. I think, if people are interested in it, it's a hook to get people into it. But actually, when you ask them the most important one, it is those rises in food and energy, so that link is being made, and there's an opportunity to build on that. Go on to the next slide, and you can see actually there's quite a degree of consistency across the segments when it comes to the cost of food and energy. Actually, established liberals slightly less likely to say that, but that's generally because they're a more economically secure group than the others. But most of us around that kind of 50% mark. Whereas some of the other issues, you see the much starker divide, right? The people worried about impact of global meat and dairy consumption are progressive activists, but there's a way into that discussion through cost. In particular. Go to the next slide. And there is a risk. The sort of counter to that, I guess, is the risk of making everything about climate. And it was interesting in a focus group, in a couple of focus groups, we've had people say, oh, it's funny that all of these rises in the cost of energy have come at the same time as people are trying to get us to use less energy. Do you think they're linked? And we talk a little bit later. The good news is in the UK, there isn't sort of mass sort of Great Reset style conspiracy theorism, but there is a bit of a link. And whilst it's still small, it is very small. It's interesting to see that slight shift in the numbers of people who think we're doing too much about climate now, which wasn't there, particularly in June during the pandemic. We go on to the next slide. And then I just wanted to give you this as well, because I think it's also important that I think we've long assumed, rightly, I think, that the greater challenge is on people who are more right-leaning. I think what's interesting is amongst some of our most progressive groups, places like Stoke Newington, but also we looked at left-leaning votes in Blackpool. There's this sense now that, actually, can we act? What is the greater injustice at the moment? Is it climate, or is it actually cost of living? And what you tend to find sometimes with progressive voters is that they are drawn to focusing on that big injustice, and then other things can fall down the agenda. So I think, in most presentations, we'd have sort of said progressives are in the bag, and clearly by and large from the polling now, but there is also that sense of, is there something else on the horizon here that's more pressing and important? We go into the next one, and I will hand over to Conleth to take you through the next few slides.
Great, thanks for that. Thanks for that, Luke. So what we've done a lot of work on in the last few months is really looking at the impacts of rising energy bills and what that means for broader energy transition. And the reassuring thing that we found is that there has been clear resolve after the Russian invasion of Ukraine to accelerate the development of renewables in the UK rather than to slow them down. And the messages about fracking or oil in the UK haven't been really as salient as that very powerful resolve to double down on renewables. And there's been an interesting insight in the focus groups I think can be helpful for broader strategic communications, is to say that this is not the first war where energy bills have gone up, and the public are exhausted, as Luke said, but that kind of exhaustion is over a period of time where they've been ripped off by conflicts over the world and by fossil fuels that have become and much more expensive during those conflicts. So tapping into that sense of exhaustion and being sold out every time is, I think, an interesting jumping off point for some kind of very powerful narratives. And I suppose one word of caution that we would say is that in our more recent groups, as the impact of raising bills has been felt, there has been a little more of the, we've got oil in the North Sea, why aren't we drilling it? Why are our bills more expensive than France? And there's some of that coming through. So it's something that we'll definitely continue to keep track of. But by and large, there's a very positive message to share on that. But what's clear from our discussions with the public and from our polling is that in order to secure the public consensus for net zero transition and for energy transition, bills have to get cheaper. It's simple as that for the public. They want cheaper bills, and they will continue to support net zero transition if they think they can get cheaper bills. Now, for the climate sector, part of that will be in kind of restructuring how the bills are calculated, and delivering an energy or renewables dividend to the public, given the lower production costs, and really selling that as a win for renewable energy. And part of it, we also think, is about shifting the narrative and the framing around home heating transition. So a lot of the focus is on the upfront costs, and those are still a concern, but where there is less information is about how much the cost saving is going to be on a month-by-month basis. So we focus the narrative on what the grants are going to be for the upfront cost, and then we end up talking about how expensive these things are. And so instead, a narrative which says your next boiler will be you switch when your boiler's broke, switch to a heat pump, and it's going to be X amount more or X amount less than it would cost to replace your boiler, and this is the saving that you're going to have on a monthly basis. That we think has much more potential, given what we've been hearing in the groups. And there's a real knowledge gap there. The public don't know how much it costs to run a heat pump, and 20% of them think that's going to cost too much to run the heat pump, and so they don't see the cost savings that are there, and particularly given how important bills are at the minute. And I think more broadly, there's a lesson here about how climate remains salient as an issue, as a top issue, and that is a good thing. But there will be other crises that come, and what we've been finding is that if climate can speak to the real top issues, to the cost of living concern in this moment, to the Russian invasion of Ukraine and security concerns, that is a more effective strategy to speak to those other concerns than to see climate as competing against those other concerns. So when climate can speak to this cost of living moment, when it can provide a solution, when transition can provide a solution for cheaper bills, then that's when you really secure support, rather than just keeping it as a high top issue in the public agenda. I'm going to play a video from a focus group in Whitney where we asked them about this renewables question.
Conleth, just in case you can't see the chats, we can't hear the sound from the video.
Oh, sorry about that. Let me just stop and reshare properly. Apologies for that.
It shouldn't be put
it
should be air source heat pumps with every new build now, standard.
Which way do you think we should be going to, if we're going to get to this energy independence? Is it about the renewable route, or is it about saying, actually, we need the sort of tried and tested, cheaper fossil fuels?
I think it's got to be renewable. I think.
Yeah, you've always got the heat in the ground, and you've always got the air outside. It's not going anywhere. You might need to make use of that. solar as well, wind
Kinetic
farms,
energy.
all of
Yeah,
that.
exactly. I agree. It's an investment in the future.
Yeah, 100% that direction.
Yeah, you pay for it now, otherwise materials are going to go up even more in the future, and it's going to be even more expensive to pilot it. Like, it needs to get done now.
They should, every new build that they should build, they should have an air source heat pump as standard built with the house. They shouldn't be putting anything else in. It should be air source heat pumps with every new build now, standard.
So you can see there the strength of support for renewables, and apologies for the technical delay. But that was a blue wall seat in Whitney, and they were established Liberals, backbone Conservatives, and civic pragmatists. So from across the board, there was this kind of strong support for renewables. So in the government's energy strategy, they didn't propose onshore wind energy. And so we asked about, do people support or oppose this? And like other polling, we found very high levels of support and very low levels of opposition. But what we thought would be helpful, because obviously there are some concerns in Parliament or in the Conservative Party about their post bags and their email inboxes about the opposition from a small group of people. So we wanted to explore a bit more, what does that opposition actually look like? And helpfully, we found that the most popular support, or the kind of top answer to explain this opposition for those who are opposed to wind energy is, to be honest, I'd do nothing about it, even if I wasn't very happy. And we think that's kind of a key insight to build the support for onshore wind energy, and that people want these things. There's a sense in some of the focus groups that we need to get real about renewable energy. So we support it, but we need to really accelerate. And to do that, we need to do some difficult things. And that might mean having more wind turbines in our area. But that type of support is interesting. And for those who remain opposed, we asked them about whether bill discounts would work. And so on the next slide, you can see how the opposition reduces significantly when offered a £10 discount every month, a £25 discount, 50, 75 and £100 discount, which means that the actual opposition to this bill that can't be either bought or people will do nothing is about 3% of the British population. Obviously, those people may well write into inboxes, but provides a helpful context for understanding that opposition. Now, at the same time, there is a risk of overselling the reliability of renewables, and we found this a little bit worrying about that this message kind of tested quite well. That there was almost majority support for the idea that renewable energy like solar and wind can't keep the lights on. Now we'll show you that this polls much better than the oil and gas reliability messages, and that is important, and that's great. But what we think, there's kind of a tonal shift about talking about how these are much more reliable, rather than trying to sell them as perfect technology at the minute. That technology will improve. Now they remain the best chance for energy, but that they're more reliable rather than the best in class. But when it comes to talking about how oil and gas are unreliable, there's interesting differences here between how progressives see, much more than the rest of the public, this idea that fossil fuels are going to run out as as a key reliability problem, whereas most of the public and a stronger average on both are more concerned about the cost and the fact that these are getting more and more expensive, rather than the fact that it's going to run out, and that people like Putin can have control over them. So focusing on the cost and the risk of leaders like Putin is a much more powerful message than focusing on the fact that they're going to run out, which might work better in progressive audiences. And more broadly, from the focus groups, it's very clear that the public do not consider this to be a climate war. And I mean, it's a popular, it's a well-known kind of analysis on many conflicts that fossil fuels and climate have kind of implications there. But the public are very clear that this is Putin's war. And it's a much more powerful climate message, pro net zero, pro transition message, to talk about it as Putin's war, which the public are much more fearful of, than to make this a war about climate, because the risk it's a more confusing message, and the risk of backlash is there as well. So we've done a lot of work on behaviour change, and in some of the other groups, or some of the other webinars, we will talk about our work on heat pumps and the benefits of them, and electric vehicles. But within the cost of living context, we thought we'd touch briefly on these. One is that people are very concerned about the upfront costs of electric vehicles, and progressive activists and established liberals, they are the most likely to consider that they're going to switch in the next few years, because they can see the cost savings, and they're more likely to be able to afford the upfront cost. Our advice is focus on those groups, focus on those types of people, while everyone else is struggling, because whenever you're thinking about whether or not you can pay your gas bill next month, you're not thinking about whether or not you can buy an electric car. So the focus for this period of time should be on those who are more likely to switch, rather than switching those who are more skeptical at the minute to support. And again, there's concerns about prices, very practical concerns about charging points, and we've also found kind of the growing conspiracy style thinking in focus groups, and we'll do a bit more of that in the next session. But this idea that batteries of electric cars blow up is something that comes up very regularly in the focus groups, and something to think about as we frame the broader switch to EVs message. On heat pumps, as I said before, shifting the debate from a sole focus on upfront costs to the cost savings of on your monthly bills. And we found some kind of very interesting insights about the people who should be delivering this message. So plumbers and installers are the people who can convince homeowners across the country to switch from their current boiler to heat pumps, and they are the people who need to be giving them the cost of living messages. It's not going to be the corporate communications of energy companies. Obviously, advertising and everything will have a role, but the most powerful and the quickest conversion rate from people who are skeptical about this to people who actually will make the plunge and go for a heat pump is through those conversations with plumbers and installers. That's who the public are telling us they want to hear this information from. And there's something to be again cautious about, is this idea that the public think they've been asked to change very regularly over the past period of time. So they've been asked to switch to gas boilers, and now they're being asked to switch to heat pumps, and making the narrative about your next boiler whenever your boiler breaks down allows to kind of shift a bit, that or kind of deal with that lack of trust, or that low levels of trust, and that tiredness that we're always being asked. The government are always changing their mind, and we always have to change things. And it's just that kind of stems from different segments having different expectations about behaviour change. So here, 60% of progressive activists think that we should be making changes to our houses, like solar panels and better insulation, but it's much lower in other segments. So being aware of that as we build up these frames is really important. And finally, these are kind of three fears that we've got from the focus groups mainly. As I said, the government changing their mind, but also that fear of being ripped off, and the double glazing salesman who sold dodgy double glazing comes up regularly in focus groups, and this idea that this new technology is going to be ripped off. And in a cost of living crisis, there's a higher premium on making sure that people aren't ripped off, because it hurts even more. And then there's also the fear that it won't work. So those are the fears that the narratives need to focus in on. And we've talked about the kind of rise in conspiracy thinking, and we regularly in focus groups now hear about the Great Reset. We regularly hear about the Sabo claims about Starmer, and the rise of disinformation and conspiracy theories is evident in the focus groups. But it places a premium on not giving material for those conspiracies to thrive on, and that is particularly in how we talk about people changing their behaviour for cost of living reasons, and not appearing to celebrate that because there's good climate or good transition impacts, because that it's more likely to get the public thinking that that this is all part of some big conspiracy or plan. There is like light reinforcement of those things, which is good, because these things will be needed, behaviour change will be needed, but there's a delicate balance to find there so that it doesn't fuel conspiracy theories. And then just very quickly on messengers, and we'll be able to talk more about messengers in the following sessions. But just that Martin Lewis is a very powerful messenger, and he adds support, particularly with groups who are more skeptical or less bought on net zero transition. So whenever you add Martin Lewis's name to a message about who would you listen to when you talk about climate change, people who give you tips on how to save money, you add Martin Lewis's name. And with these segments, you add 16 points with the background Conservatives, 14 points with the Loyal Nationals, and 11 points with the disengaged battlers. So he's a very powerful name. And the other group or messenger who are very powerful are people who are adversely affected by this. They have an authority to speak on these matters, and so people who are at risk of losing out from transition, particularly with the cost of living crisis, they are the people who people want to hear. So with that, we'll stop the presentation and just open it up to any questions.